Every single person who has ever lived shares one thing in common. Every king, every farmer, every artist, every person you've ever met, all 100 billion humans who have ever existed are here because of an unbroken chain of pairing stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Not one link in that chain ever broke. If it had, you wouldn't exist. But here's what almost nobody stops to think about. How did that actually work? Before dating apps, before weddings, before marriage as a legal institution, before even the concept of a couple as we understand it. How did our ancient ancestors actually find partners, form bonds, and raise the next generation? Did they pair off for life like some animals do? Did they live in large groups with no fixed partners? How did they avoid the genetic problems of small populations? And how do we even know any of this, given that none of it left behind a written record? That's what we're talking about today. And the answer is one of the most fascinating detective stories in all of science. Because to reconstruct the love lives of people who died tens of thousands of years ago, researchers have had to become detectives, reading clues in bones, in genes, in the behavior of our closest animal relatives, and in the few human societies that still live something like the ancient way. Buckle up. Let's rewind. First, let's be honest about how little we can directly observe, and why this question is so genuinely hard to answer. The behaviors we're asking about, how people paired up, how they bonded, how they organized family life, leave almost no direct trace in the archaeological record. A stone tool survives for 1,000,000 years. A relationship survives for nothing. There's no fossil of a marriage. There's no artifact of affection. So, for a long time, this was considered nearly impossible to study scientifically. People could speculate, but they couldn't really know. What changed everything was the combination of several different lines of evidence, each imperfect on its own, but powerful when assembled together. Researchers learned to triangulate, to take clues from completely different fields and see where they converge. And when several independent methods all point to the same conclusion, you can start to be genuinely confident, even about something as intimate and ancient as how our ancestors formed families. So before we get to the answers, let's understand the 4 big sources of clues, because the how we know is honestly as interesting as the what we know. The first clue comes from our own bodies, the physical traits humans evolved, which carry hidden information about our mating past. The second comes from comparing ourselves to other primates, especially chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas, whose social systems hint at what our shared ancestors might have done. The third comes from modern hunter-gatherer societies, which offer a living window into how humans organized family life for most of our history. And the fourth, and most revolutionary, comes from ancient DNA, the ability to read genetic material from people who died tens of thousands of years ago and reconstruct who was related to whom. Together, these 4 lenses let us reconstruct a remarkably detailed picture. Let's start with the first clue: what our own bodies reveal. This is one of the cleverest tools in the whole field. It turns out that the way a species organizes its mating life leaves physical signatures on the body itself. And by reading those signatures, scientists can make educated guesses about our deep past. Consider body size differences between males and females, a feature biologists call sexual dimorphism. In species where a few males compete intensely to control large groups of females, like gorillas, males evolve to be dramatically larger than females because size wins those competitions. In species that form more equal pair bonds, the size difference between males and females tends to be much smaller. So where do humans fall? Right in the middle, but leaning toward the smaller difference end. Human males are, on average, somewhat larger than females, but nowhere near the dramatic gap you see in gorillas. This points away from a system where a single male dominates a large group and towards something more pair-oriented, though not perfectly so. The interesting twist is that early human ancestors, millions of years ago, showed greater size differences, which gradually reduced over evolutionary time. In other words, the physical evidence suggests our ancestors shifted, over millions of years, away from intense male competition and towards more stable partnerships. There are other bodily clues, too, woven into our biology, all pointing in a similar direction. Humans appear to be a species built for relatively stable pair bonds, but with enough flexibility and variation that no single rigid system fits everyone. This mostly pair bonding but flexible pattern is a theme we'll see confirmed again and again from completely different angles. The second clue comes from looking at our closest relatives, and it's genuinely illuminating because each one shows a radically different solution to the same problem. Chimpanzees, who share a huge portion of our DNA, live in large groups with a fluid system where there are no fixed long-term partnerships. Gorillas do something completely different. A single dominant male presides over a group of females. Bonobos, who are just as closely related to us as chimps, live in remarkably peaceful, female-centered societies with very fluid social bonds. And gibbons, more distant relatives, form long-term pair bonds that can last for life. Here's the fascinating part. Our primate relatives have tried nearly every possible arrangement. There is no single natural primate system that we can simply assume humans inherited. Instead, what this comparison tells us is that primate social systems are flexible and shaped by environment, diet, and the specific pressures each species faces. And humans? Humans turn out to be the most flexible of all. We're the primate that doesn't fit neatly into any single category. And that, paradoxically, is the most human thing about us. Our closest relatives show us the menu of possibilities. They show us that there was nothing inevitable about how humans ended up organizing family life, which means whatever system our ancestors developed, they developed it for their own particular reasons. And that brings us to the most important factor of all. The third clue, and one of the most powerful, comes from modern hunter-gatherer societies. Communities that, until recently, lived in ways broadly similar to how all humans lived for the vast majority of our history. They aren't perfect time capsules. They're modern people with their own complex histories. But studied carefully and respectfully, they reveal patterns that show up across many different groups on different continents. And those shared patterns hint at something deep about human nature. And here's what researchers have found, again and again. Across a huge range of these societies, the most common pattern is something like this. People form partnerships that are usually long-term but not always permanent, embedded within a larger cooperative group that shares the work of survival and the raising of children. This is the key insight. Human family life, for most of our history, was not a couple living alone. It was a couple, or a small set of bonded partners, nested inside a wider web of relatives and group members who all participated in raising the next generation. Anthropologists have a phrase for the human approach to raising children. We are cooperative breeders. Unlike most apes, where a mother raises her young largely alone, human children were raised by a whole network. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, and other group members all pitching in. This turns out to be one of the most important facts about our species. Human babies are extraordinarily demanding. They're helpless for years, with huge brains that need enormous resources to grow. A single mother in the wild could not realistically provide everything a human child needs alone. The solution our ancestors evolved was to share the load across the whole group, and this had profound effects on how partnerships worked. Bonds between partners weren't just about the two people involved. They were embedded in and supported by the entire community. The group was the cradle. This also explains the role of those grandparents we keep coming back to. In most animals, females reproduce until the end of their lives. Humans are unusual in having a long life after reproduction ends, and one major theory is that grandmothers, freed from raising their own young, became essential helpers in raising their grandchildren. A child with an involved grandmother had better odds. So evolution favored long post-reproductive life, precisely because it strengthened the cooperative web that human family life depended on. Now for the fourth clue, the one that has revolutionized this entire field in just the last couple of decades: ancient DNA. This is genuinely one of the most astonishing scientific achievements of our time. Researchers have learned to extract genetic material from human remains tens of thousands of years old and read it. And by reading the DNA of multiple individuals found together, they can reconstruct who was related to whom, building family trees of people who lived in the Ice Age. The results have been remarkable. By studying the genetics of ancient communities, researchers have been able to detect patterns in how groups organize themselves. For example, in some ancient communities, genetic evidence suggests that when partners came together, one of them typically moved to join the other's group, a practice that helped connect different bands and, crucially, helped avoid the genetic dangers of a small, closed population. And that points to one of the most important survival problems our ancestors had to solve: avoiding the risks of too small a population. When a group is small and isolated, and people only ever pair within that tiny group, harmful genetic effects accumulate over generations. Our ancestors needed a way to keep their gene pool healthy and diverse. And the ancient DNA evidence, combined with everything else, suggests that they did exactly that. Through networks that connected different bands, allowing people and genes to flow between groups. This is profoundly important. It means our ancestors weren't living in isolated little family units. They were part of larger, interconnected networks, webs of bands that met, exchanged members, formed alliances, and maintained the genetic diversity that kept the population healthy. Some of the oldest evidence we have of long-distance connection between human groups, objects and materials moving across vast distances, fits this picture. These networks weren't only about trade. They were about keeping the human population connected, diverse, and viable across the generations. Ancient DNA has even revealed something stranger and more wonderful: that our ancestors connected not just with other groups of their own kind, but with other human species entirely. The genetic evidence shows that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. To this day, many people alive carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a living genetic record of encounters between two different kinds of humans, tens of thousands of years ago. The same is true of another ancient human group, the Denisovans. Our ancestors were part of a connected, intermingling human world far more complex than we ever imagined. So now let's put all four clues together and ask, what's the overall picture? When you combine the evidence from our bodies, our primate relatives, modern hunter-gatherers, and ancient DNA, a consistent and beautiful picture emerges. And the headline is this: human family life was built on flexibility, cooperation, and connection. Our ancestors most likely formed partnerships that were typically long-term, but they did so within a larger, deeply cooperative group. Children were raised not by isolated couples, but by whole communities. Bonds between people were supported and reinforced by the entire band, and different bands were connected to one another through wider networks that kept the population genetically healthy and socially linked. What's striking is how human this picture is. It's not the rigid system of the gorilla, nor the fluid free-for-all of the chimpanzee. It's something more complex, more cooperative, and more flexible than any of our relatives. A system built around the central human challenge of raising those extraordinarily demanding, big-brained children, which required everyone to work together. And there's another crucial point. There was likely no single universal system. Human societies, then as now, almost certainly varied. Different environments, different pressures, and different cultures probably produced different arrangements in different places and times. The one universal isn't a particular structure. It's the flexibility itself. Humans are the species that adapts its social arrangements to its circumstances. That adaptability may be one of the deepest secrets of our success. Here's a dimension that often gets overlooked, but is genuinely central: the role of emotion and bonding. The fact that humans don't just pair for practical reasons, but actually form deep emotional attachments. This is something our biology clearly evolved for. The human brain produces powerful bonding chemistry. The same neurological systems involved in deep attachment, in the bond between parent and child, in the feeling of closeness to another person. These systems are ancient. They long predate writing, agriculture, or civilization, which means the feelings, attachment, devotion, the pull toward another person, the grief of loss, are not modern cultural inventions. They are deep, evolved parts of being human, present in our ancestors just as they are in us. This matters because it's easy to discuss ancient mating in cold, clinical terms, as if it were just biology, just survival, just genetics. But the evidence strongly suggests that our ancestors felt things. They formed attachments. They had preferences. They experienced something we would recognize as connection. The emotional architecture that underlies human bonding today was almost certainly there in people 40,000 years ago, sitting by their fires. We can see hints of this even in the archaeological record. There are ancient burials where individuals were laid to rest together, carefully, with evident care. There are signs that ancient humans grieved their dead and treated them with tenderness. These aren't the marks of creatures who simply paired mechanically. They're the marks of beings who bonded, who cared, who felt the loss of those they were close to. The deep emotional life that surrounds human relationships isn't a modern luxury. It's one of the oldest parts of who we are. By the time we reach the dawn of recorded history, human societies had developed an enormous variety of formal systems around partnership and family, complex traditions, customs, and rules that varied from culture to culture. But all of these built upon a foundation that had been laid over hundreds of thousands of years. The deep human tendency toward cooperative family life, embedded in larger communities, connected across wider networks, and bound together by genuine emotional attachment. What's remarkable is how much of that ancient foundation is still with us. The fact that humans form lasting bonds, the fact that we raise children cooperatively, leaning on family and community, the fact that we feel deep attachment and grieve loss, the fact that we connect across groups, forming ever wider webs of relationship. All of these are inheritances from our deep past, patterns established by ancestors whose names we'll never know. In a world we can barely imagine, the specifics have changed beyond recognition. But the underlying human pattern, bond, cooperate, connect, care, has remained remarkably constant across the entire span of our existence. There's a quiet truth to close on. We tend to think of how we form families and relationships as either something purely modern and cultural, or something purely biological and primitive. But the real story is neither. It's a continuous thread running from our most ancient ancestors all the way to the present day. The people who lived tens of thousands of years ago weren't fundamentally different from us in the things that matter most here. They formed bonds. They raised children together. They relied on family and community. They connected with other groups. They felt attachment and devotion and loss. The emotional and social core of human relationships was already in place, fully formed in people who had no writing, no cities, and no idea that we would one day exist to wonder about them. So how did ancient humans mate? Not as isolated couples and not as a chaotic crowd, but as members of cooperative communities, forming bonds that were supported by the whole group. Connected to wider networks that kept humanity healthy and linked, all held together by the same deep emotional currents that move us today. Their family lives were, in the ways that count, recognizably human. And maybe that's the most striking realization of all. Across all that time, across all that distance, across everything that separates their world from ours, when it came to bonding, caring, and building families together, they were already us. We are simply the latest links in a chain of connection that has never once been broken, stretching back into the deep past and, with any luck, far into the future.